Hey, what is up everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
Long before the galaxy knew the weight of 10,000 years of war, long before the Imperium had crumbled into the paranoid, cathedral-choked ruin it would one day become, there was a dream. It was a dream held by a single being, older than any civilization still drawing breath among the stars. A figure so ancient that his true name has been forgotten by every tongue that ever tried to speak it. They call him the Emperor of Mankind. And in the waning centuries of the 30th millennium, standing in gene laboratories buried beneath the Himalayan mountains of old Earth, he set about creating his masterwork. Not warships, not weapons, not even the legions of superhuman soldiers that would come to bear his banner across a million worlds. No, the Emperor's greatest ambition was far more personal, far more dangerous, and far more tragic than any of those things. He created sons, 20 of them. They were called the Primarchs, and each one was a demigod in his own right, and a being of such raw physical power and towering intellect that they stood apart from humanity the way a star stands apart from the candle flame beneath it. They were taller than any mortal man, stronger than the mightiest warriors of any age, smarter than the finest scholars of 1,000 worlds combined. Their voices could rally entire populations to war or reduce hardened killers to weeping children. They were engineered to be generals, statesmen, conquerors, and kings. They were the Emperor's instruments of reunification, 20 keys meant to unlock a galaxy drowning in darkness and ignorance and blood. And they were, every single one of them, deeply and irreparably flawed. This is their story, the story of where they came from, what shaped them, and why those early, formative years on distant and often savage worlds planted the seeds for the greatest catastrophe humanity would ever know. So settle in, and let your mind drift to places where the stars burn cold, and the silence between worlds hums with the echo of prayers no God will ever answer. And let us begin. To understand the Primarchs, you must first understand the age that demanded their creation. The galaxy of the late 29th and early 30th millennium was a broken thing, a shattered mirror reflecting humanity's greatest achievements and its deepest failures in equal measure. Yes, the age of strife had severed the ties between human-settled worlds for thousands of years. Warp storms of unimaginable ferocity had made interstellar travel all but impossible. And in that isolation, human civilizations had devolved, collapsed, been enslaved by alien predators, or simply winked out like candles in a hurricane. Terra itself, the birthplace of the species, had become a wasteland of warring techno-barbarian states, each one claiming dominion over a poisoned and overcrowded world that was eating itself alive. The Emperor had already begun his work of reunification on Terra, wielding an army of genetically modified super soldiers called the Thunder Warriors to crush the techno-barbarian warlords and forge a single planetary government. But the Thunder Warriors were flawed. They were powerful but unstable, aggressive but short-lived, effective in battle but impossible to control in peacetime. They were a first draft, a proof of concept. And once they had served their purpose, the Emperor had them quietly eliminated and replaced with a more refined creation, the Space Marines. But the Space Marines, for all their superhuman capabilities, needed leaders. Not merely officers or tacticians, but beings of such overwhelming power and presence that they could serve as the command structure for armies numbering in the tens of thousands, inspire loyalty that bordered on worship, and make decisions of strategic and political complexity that would have overwhelmed any merely human mind. The Emperor needed 20 such beings, 20 sons, each one crafted to embody a different aspect of his own vast capabilities, each one designed to complement and balance the others, forming a leadership council that could administer a galactic empire while simultaneously prosecuting the most ambitious military campaign in human history. The project was undertaken in absolute secrecy, was in laboratories carved from the living rock beneath the Himalayan mountains, shielded by every ward and barrier that science and psychic power could devise. He was aided by figures like Amara Astarte, the biotechnical division director, whose name would later be given to the Space Marines themselves, the Adeptus Astartes. She oversaw much of the technical work, though she would eventually come to believe that the entire project was doomed, as a conviction that led her to attempt the destruction of the genetic knowledge behind the Primarchs' creation. The Emperor did not create the Primarchs alone. He drew upon his own genetic material as the foundation, his own ancient and impossibly complex genome, serving as the root from which 20 distinct strands of superhuman DNA were cultivated. But he went further. He bargained with forces that defied conventional science. According to some accounts, the Emperor traveled to the distant world of Molech and passed through a gateway into the warp itself, the seething psychic dimension that lies beneath the skin of reality. What he found there, what bargains he struck, what knowledge he carried back with him, remains one of the deepest and most closely guarded secrets in all of human history. But whatever the Emperor gained on the other side of that threshold, it gave him the power to do what no other being had ever accomplished. He breathed genuine life into engineered flesh. He made gods from genetic code. There was also Erda, a figure whose existence was hidden for millennia. She was a perpetual, one of those rare and ancient beings who could not truly die, and her genetic material was woven into the Primarchs alongside the Emperor's own. In a very real sense, she was their mother. And like so many mothers in stories that end in tragedy, she came to fear what her children were being created to become. Tools, weapons, as instruments of a grand design that cared nothing for their individual happiness or their souls. Some accounts suggest it was Erda herself who opened the warp vortex that scattered the Primarchs, not the Chaos gods alone. She did it, these whispered histories claim, to save her children from the cold and utilitarian fate the Emperor had planned for them. If that is true, then the irony is almost unbearable, because in trying to save them, she condemned them to fates far worse than anything the Emperor might have designed. The scattering happened without warning. One moment, the 20 infant Primarchs floated in their gestation capsules beneath the mountains of terror, surrounded by the hum of gene forges and the vigilant eyes of the Emperor's most trusted servants. The next, a screaming vortex of warp energy tore through every safeguard, every psychic ward, or every barrier of science and sorcery that the Emperor had erected around his children. The capsules were ripped from their moorings and hurled into the Imperium, that howling dimension of nightmares and impossible geometry, and scattered across the galaxy like seeds thrown to a hurricane wind. Each one came to rest on a different world. Each infant Primarch was left alone, a godling among mortals, to grow and be shaped by whatever circumstances that hostile or welcoming planet provided. The Emperor was devastated. He could sense that his sons still lived, flickering presences scattered impossibly far across the stars. But he could not reach them, not yet. The warp storms that plagued the galaxy in that age made travel uncertain and communication nearly impossible. So he did what he could with what remained. The genetic samples he had taken before the scattering were used to create the Space Marine legions, 20 armies of superhuman warriors, and each one carrying a diluted echo of a specific Primarch's genetic code. And when the warp storms finally receded enough for the Emperor to launch his great crusade, the reunification of humanity under a single banner, he set out to find his lost sons one by one. What he found, on world after world, was both miraculous and heartbreaking. Every Primarch had not only survived but thrived, rising to positions of dominance, leadership, or legend on whatever planet had caught their falling capsule. They had conquered nations, built civilizations, overthrown tyrants, or become tyrants themselves. They had been shaped by their worlds, molded by the cultures and hardships they had been thrust into, and those formative experiences had left marks that no amount of reunification with their true father could ever erase. The 20 sons of the Emperor were brilliant, powerful, and magnificent. They were also wounded, prideful, resentful, ambitious, lonely, angry, and afraid. And in those wounds, from those secret places where the armor of a demigod's confidence did not quite cover the scared child underneath, the seeds of the Horus heresy were already growing. Let us meet them. Let us walk alongside each of these towering figures in the days before everything went wrong, and see them not as the legends or the villains they would become, but as the lost children they once were. The first Primarch recovered by the Emperor, at least according to the most widely accepted accounts, was Horus. And his capsule had landed on Chthoniya, a world that orbited close enough to Terra's own solar system that it could be reached without warp travel, a detail that would prove significant. Chthoniya was not a kind world. It had been colonized in the earliest days of human expansion into the stars, and its natural resources had been stripped away over millennia, until nothing remained but a hollow, honeycombed shell of exhausted mines, crumbling industrial ruins, and decaying hive cities. The planet was, for all practical purposes, spent. What little society remained had devolved into a brutal hierarchy of gang warfare, where kill teams fought in the labyrinthine tunnels beneath the surface for scraps of food, territory, and the right to keep breathing for one more day. Into this wasteland fell the infant Primarch. He was found by a gang overlord named Kagedon, who gave the boy the Chthonian no-name of Nergui, a placeholder that carried no identity because on Chthoniya, you earned your true name through blood. The boy who would become Horus grew up in those tunnels, learning the rhythms of violence, the politics of survival, and the cold mathematics of who lives and who dies in a world where mercy is simply a slower kind of suicide. He fought in the perpetual gang wars, killed when he had to, led when others faltered, and grew at a rate that alarmed even the hardened criminals who had taken him in. The turning point came when young Nergui stumbled upon the very capsule that had carried him to Chthoniya, now being excavated by Mechanicum adepts from Mars. He killed one of the tech priests, stole the weapon, and fled back to Kagedon, but his recklessness drew pursuit, and the Mechanicum came digging through the surface into their stronghold. As the chamber collapsed around them, and most of the gang lay dead or dying, Kagedon instructed the boy to slay him, in a final act that would grant him his kill name. And when the boy who had been Nergi plunged the blade into his adoptive father, something happened. Buried memories surged to the surface. Knowledge of the galaxy, of technology, of who and what he truly was, flooded through him. His body began to grow, to swell with the dormant power of a Primarch finally awakened. When the Mechanicum adepts finally broke through into the chamber, it was not a boy who stood before them, it was Horus. The Emperor arrived on Chthoniya and found in Horus everything he had hoped for in a son. Here was a being of immense charisma, a natural leader whose presence could calm a room or ignite a battlefield with equal ease. Horus was charming where the Emperor could be cold. He was approachable where his father was distant. He understood people, not as data points in a grand strategy, but as individuals with desires and fears and loyalties that could be won. For decades, Horus was the Emperor's only recovered son, and the bond between them grew deeper than anything either would share with another being. The Emperor loved Horus, or came as close to love as a being of his incomprehensible power and ancient calculation could manage. And Horus loved his father with the desperate, all-consuming devotion of a child who has finally found the parent he never knew he was missing. This bond would prove to be the most dangerous thing in the galaxy, because when it broke, when Horus's love curdled into resentment and betrayal, the shockwave would tear the Imperium in half and leave humanity bleeding for 10,000 years. Under Horus's command, the 16th Legion, renamed the Lunar Wolves in honor of their early victories on Terra's moon, became one of the most celebrated fighting forces in the Great Crusade. They were pragmatic, flexible, and devastatingly effective, preferring to identify the enemy's weak point and strike it with overwhelming force rather than grinding through lengthy campaigns. Horus led from the front, but thought like a statesman, winning as many worlds through diplomacy and personal charisma as he did through military dominance. Other Primarchs respected him, even those who respected no one else. The emperor trusted him above all others. For decades, father and son fought side by side. And in those years, Horus accumulated a record of victories that was second to none. He was not merely a great general, he was a great man, or as close to a man as a Primarch could be. He remembered the names of his warriors. He listened to their concerns. He inspired them not through fear or awe, but through a genuine warmth that made every soldier under his command feel valued and seen. Now, when the emperor began to withdraw from the Great Crusade to pursue a secret project beneath the imperial palace, a project involving the construction of a human-controlled passage through the webway that would have freed humanity from its dependence on the warp, it was Horus who was chosen to take his father's place. He was elevated to the rank of War Master, the supreme commander of all imperial military forces, the most powerful title any being beneath the emperor himself had ever held. The honor should have been the crowning moment of Horus's life. Instead, it was the beginning of his destruction. The emperor departed without fully explaining his reasons, leaving Horus to wonder whether his father's sudden withdrawal was a sign of trust or abandonment. And into that uncertainty stepped Erebus, the first chaplain of the Wordbearers Legion, a being who had already pledged his soul to the Chaos Gods, and who now set about the patient, methodical work of corrupting the War Master. Yet the trap was sprung on the world of Davin, where Horus was grievously wounded by a chaos-tainted blade. Desperate to save their Primarch, the Lunar Wolves allowed Erebus to bring Horus to a temple on Davin's moon, where lodge priests supposedly possessed the healing arts to restore him. What actually happened in that temple was far more sinister. Horus's consciousness was drawn into the warp, where he was shown visions of a future in which the emperor had cast aside his Primarchs. He proclaimed himself a god, and used his sons as disposable tools in a bid for personal deification. The visions were lies, carefully constructed fabrications tailored to exploit every insecurity and resentment that had been growing in Horus's heart since the day the emperor left the crusade without a proper explanation. But to Horus, weakened by his wounds and desperate for answers, they felt like truth. He emerged from the temple a changed being. On the surface, the War Master still looked the same, still spoke with the same commanding voice, still radiated the same magnetic charisma. But something fundamental had shifted inside him. The love he had felt for the Emperor had been transmuted into something else, a burning conviction that his father had betrayed him and must be stopped before he could betray all of humanity. Horus began to gather allies, reaching out to brothers who nursed their own grievances, and offering them validation and purpose and the promise of a galaxy free from the Emperor's tyranny. It was the most persuasive recruitment campaign in history, conducted by the most charismatic being alive, and it worked. By the time the first shots of the heresy were fired, fully half of the Emperor's sons had pledged their allegiance to the War Master, and that trust would be the Emperor's gravest miscalculation. Yes, the second Primarch we will speak of was found on a world so hostile that survival itself was a kind of miracle. Lionel Johnson, the Primarch of the Dark Angels, came to rest on Caliban, a planet of vast and ancient forests where the canopy was so thick that sunlight barely reached the ground, and the shadows between the trees were home to creatures warped by the touch of chaos itself. Caliban sat close to the Eye of Terror, that wound in reality where the warp bleeds through into the material universe, and its proximity to that seething hellmouth had twisted the wildlife into something nightmarish. Great beasts stalked the forests, creatures of fang and claw and unnatural malice that made the planet a death trap for anyone foolish enough to wander beyond the walls of the fortress monasteries. The infant lion landed in the deepest and most remote part of those forests, far from any human settlement. How he survived his first decade of life remains completely unknown. There are no records, no legends, no whispered tales of a wild child among the trees. He simply endured, alone, for 10 years in a wilderness that would have killed a grown man within minutes. When a band of warrior knights from a monastic order called simply the Order finally encountered him, he was feral, barely capable of speech, more animal than man. But one of those knights, a warrior named Luther, sensed something extraordinary about this savage creature and prevented his companions from killing him. Luther became the lion's mentor, his teacher, and his closest friend. He gave the wild child a name, Lion L. Johnson, which in the Calibanite tongue means the lion, son of the forest. Under Luther's guidance, the lion learned to speak with astonishing speed, mastered the arts of war and leadership with a facility that bordered on the supernatural, and rose through the ranks of the order until he became its supreme Grand Master. Together, the lion and Luther launched a crusade to purge Caliban of its monstrous creatures, and they succeeded where generations of knights before them had failed. The planet was made safe for human habitation for the first time in living memory, and the lion was hailed as a savior. But even in those early days of triumph, there were shadows. The lion was secretive to the point of obsession, unable or unwilling to share his thoughts with even his closest confidants. He had spent his formative years alone in a nightmare forest, trusting nothing and no one, and that primal lesson of self-reliance had been burned into the deepest layers of his psyche. He could lead men, inspire them, and command their absolute loyalty, but he could never truly open himself to another being. Luther, who had saved his life and raised him from savagery, would one day feel the sting of that cold distance. And the resentment that grew in Luther's heart, the sense that he had been overshadowed and discarded by the very creature he had rescued, would fester for decades until it exploded into a betrayal that destroyed an entire world. When the Emperor arrived on Caliban, the lion recognized his father immediately and knelt without hesitation. He was given command of the First Legion, which he renamed the Dark Angels after an ancient Calibanite myth. And he threw himself into the Great Crusade with a tactical brilliance that rivaled even Horus. But the lion fought his wars in shadow and secrecy, hoarding knowledge and operating with a level of independence that made his brother Primarchs deeply uneasy. He trusted no one completely, confided in no one fully, and carried within himself a darkness that not even the Emperor's light could fully illuminate. In the end, that darkness would cost him everything. Yet the world of Chemos was dying when Fulgrim arrived. His capsule fell from the sky onto a planet that had been slowly suffocating for centuries, its industry failing, its resources dwindling, its population scraping by on the barest margins of survival. The inhabitants of Chemos lived in factory hive settlements, working themselves to early graves to maintain the crumbling infrastructure that kept their civilization from collapsing entirely. There was no art on Chemos, no music, no beauty, as there was only the endless, grinding labor of a people too exhausted to do anything but survive. The infant Fulgrim was found by the workers of one such settlement and raised among them. Even as a child, he was breathtaking, possessed of a beauty that seemed almost painful to look upon, and a drive for perfection that bordered on the pathological. Where other Primarchs might have conquered their worlds through military force, a Fulgrim transformed Chemos through sheer organizational genius and an absolute refusal to accept anything less than excellence. He redesigned the failing factories, optimized production methods, revitalized agricultural yields, and within a few short years had turned a dying world into one that was not merely surviving, but thriving. And he did not stop there. Once the necessities of life were secured, Fulgrim turned his attention to what he considered the true markers of civilization: art, culture, philosophy, and beauty. Under his guidance, the people of Chemos began to create again, to paint and sculpt and compose music, to remember what it meant to be human rather than merely alive. The Emperor was deeply impressed when he arrived. Here was a son who had not merely conquered his world, but elevated it, who understood that the purpose of power was not domination, but the creation of something worth defending. Fulgrim was given command of the Third Legion, which he renamed the Emperor's Children, the only legion ever granted the honor of bearing the Emperor's own name upon their heraldry. It was an honor that filled Fulgrim with a pride so fierce it burned, and that pride, that unquenchable thirst for perfection, for being the best, for exceeding every standard and surpassing every limit, would eventually lead him down a path so dark that the beautiful Primarch of Chemos would become something unrecognizable, born a creature of excess and depravity that served the chaos god Slanesh with the same obsessive devotion he had once directed toward the pursuit of excellence. But in those early days, standing on the transformed surface of Chemos, with his father's approval warming his hearts, Fulgrim knew only the joy of purpose fulfilled and the burning desire to achieve even greater things. If Fulgrim's story began with beauty and ended in corruption, then the story of Perturabo is its mirror image, as a tale that began in bitterness and only grew more bitter with every passing year. The Primarch of the Iron Warriors landed on Olympia, a world of mountainous terrain and warring city-states, locked in an endless cycle of siege and counter-siege. He was found and adopted by Damokos, the tyrant of the city-state of Lokos, a shrewd and calculating ruler who recognized the boy's staggering mathematical genius and immediately began exploiting it. Perturabo was brilliant in ways that few of his brothers could match. He could look at a fortress and see its weaknesses the way a musician sees the notes in a chord. He could design defensive works of such complexity and sophistication that they seemed almost alive, anticipating threats before they materialized and adapting to changing conditions in real time. Under his direction, Lokos crushed every rival city-state on Olympia, becoming the dominant power on the planet through the sheer superiority of Perturabo's military engineering. But Perturabo took no joy in his victories. Where Fulgrim burned with pride and Horus radiated charisma, Perturabo seethed with a cold, corrosive resentment that ate at him from the inside. He felt used. He felt unappreciated. He felt that his talents were taken for granted, that he was treated as a tool rather than a person, that no one saw the man behind the mathematical mind. Damokos had raised him not out of love, but out of ambition, and Perturabo knew it. The people of Olympia feared him rather than adored him, and Perturabo knew that too. He built wonders and received only demands for more. He won wars and received only the coordinates of the next battlefield. When the emperor arrived and gave Perturabo command of the 4th Legion, the Iron Warriors, the Primarch threw himself into the Great Crusade with grim determination. But the pattern that had defined his life on Olympia repeated itself on a galactic scale. The Iron Warriors were given the most grueling, thankless assignments. The grinding siege warfare that no other legion wanted. The prolonged campaigns on worlds that no one cared about. The ugly, necessary work that earned no glory and produced no songs. Perturabo did it all without complaint. But the resentment inside him grew deeper with every campaign, with every casualty report, or with every word of praise directed at brothers who fought flashier wars on more prestigious battlefields. He was the Imperium's workhorse, and he knew it. And one day, when the breaking point finally came, the galaxy would learn what happens when a siege master decides to tear down everything he once built. On the endless windswept steppes of Chagoris, a world of open plains and fierce nomadic tribes, the infant Jagatai Khan fell from the sky and was adopted by the Talaskar tribe, led by a chieftain named Ong Khan. The boy grew with a speed that amazed even the battle-hardened warriors of the steppes, and by the time he was still a child, by any normal measure, he was already a warrior of frightening skill. When Ong Khan was murdered by the rival Kurayed tribe, the young Jagatai took command, led a devastating campaign of vengeance, and then did what no one on Chagoris had ever accomplished before. He united the warring tribes into a single confederacy through a combination of military brilliance, personal charisma, and a deep understanding of what made his people tick. Jagatai was not like his brothers. He did not seek dominion for its own sake. He did not burn with pride or seethe with resentment or crave his father's approval. He simply valued freedom, the freedom to ride, to fight, to live on his own terms, to feel the wind against his face and the thunder of hooves beneath him. But his white scars, the 5th Legion, fought in a style that reflected their Primarch's soul, fast, fluid, devastating, and impossible to pin down. They struck like lightning and withdrew like the wind, leaving nothing but destruction in their wake, and never staying long enough for the enemy to bring their full strength to bear. During the Horus heresy, many believed the Khan would side with the traitors. He was independent, skeptical of authority, and openly critical of aspects of imperial governance that he considered oppressive. But those who thought Jagatai Khan was a rebel misunderstood him entirely. He was a free man who chose to serve, and there is a world of difference between a servant who obeys because he must, and one who obeys because he has weighed the alternatives and decided, freely and with clear eyes, that service is the right path. The Khan chose loyalty, and his choice was as devastating to the traitor cause as any siege or bombardment. After the heresy, the Khan pursued a raiding party of dark-skinned alien pirates, the Drukhari, through one of their webway portals and vanished from imperial records entirely. Whether he lives or dies, whether he roams the twisted corridors of the webway still, or has found some other fate beyond the knowledge of any living soul, no one can say. But the White Scars believe that their father will return when the Imperium needs him most. And on the wind-blasted plains of Chogoris, the old songs still carry the promise that the great Khan rides eternal. Leman Russ landed on Fenris, and Fenris made him into exactly what it made everything that survived its cruelty: dangerous beyond measure and loyal to the death. Fenris is a death world in the truest sense of the term, a planet of frozen oceans, volcanic islands, and predators so lethal that the human population lives in a state of constant, generational warfare simply to avoid extinction. The tribes of Fenris are warriors born, raised from infancy with a weapon in one hand and a prayer on their lips, and they measure a person's worth by one standard and one standard only: whether you can survive what the world throws at you. The infant Russ was found and raised by a pack of enormous Fenrisian wolves, yet creatures of such size and ferocity that they dwarfed the wolves of any other world. He grew up wild, running with the pack, hunting with fang and claw, sleeping under stars that burned cold in Fenris's perpetual winter. When the human tribes finally encountered him, he was more wolf than man, a towering figure of raw, primal power who could outfight, outrun, and outthink anything the planet had to offer. He was adopted by a tribal king named Thengir, who recognized the young savage's potential and raised him as his heir. After Thengir's death, Russ united the warring tribes through feats of strength, cunning, and a boisterous, larger-than-life personality that made men want to follow him into the jaws of death itself. When the Emperor came to Fenris, Russ did not kneel. He challenged his father to 3 contests: a contest of eating, a contest of drinking, and a contest of combat. Russ won the first 2 and lost the third, though the accounts of how badly he lost vary depending on who tells the story. But the point was made. Russ followed the Emperor not because he was overwhelmed or intimidated, but because the Emperor had proven himself worthy of a warrior's respect. Russ was given command of the 6th Legion, the Space Wolves, and his role within the Imperium was one that few others could have borne. He was the Emperor's executioner. When a world would not comply, as when diplomacy failed and even the threat of overwhelming force was not enough, when something had to be not merely defeated but destroyed utterly and completely, the Emperor unleashed Russ and his wolves. It was a burden that weighed on Russ more heavily than he ever let on. He hid his doubts behind a mask of boisterous barbarism, laughing louder than anyone, drinking deeper than anyone, and fighting harder than anyone so that no one would see the troubled soul beneath the fangs and fury. As the burning of Prospero haunted him, ordered by the Emperor to bring his brother Magnus to heel for the crime of forbidden sorcery, Russ attacked the Thousand Sons' homeworld with a fury that left Prospero a scorched ruin. Whether Russ was manipulated into going further than the Emperor intended, or whether he followed his orders exactly as they were given, remains one of the most bitterly contested questions in Imperial history. But Russ himself came to doubt, and that doubt gnawed at him for the rest of his days. After the heresy, the Wolf King departed on a quest whose nature remains unknown. Some say he sought a way to heal the Emperor. Others say he went to find the mythical Tree of Life. The Space Wolves believe he will return at the wolf time, the hour of humanity's greatest need, to lead them one final time. Rogel Dawn was raised on the ice world of Inwit, a barren sphere of frozen oceans and howling winds, where survival demanded absolute discipline and an unyielding refusal to surrender to the cold. He was adopted by the ruling House of Dawn and raised among the ice-caste warriors who inhabited the planet's fortress hives. Very little is known about his early years, which is fitting for a Primarch who valued actions over words and results over stories. What is known is that Dawn became the ruler of his entire world and then expanded his dominion to the surrounding star systems, building a small empire bound together by the same qualities that would come to define his legion: endurance, loyalty, and an absolute commitment to duty. When the Emperor found Dawn, the Primarch greeted his father from the Bridge of the Phalanx, an ancient and enormous space station that he had spent years restoring to functional status. The Emperor was so impressed that he returned the Phalanx to Dawn's keeping and gave him command of the 7th Legion, the Imperial Fists. Dawn was the 7th Primarch found, and from the moment of their reunion, he became one of the Emperor's most trusted sons. Where Horus was the Emperor's favoured general and Rabut Gilliman was his greatest administrator, Dawn was his shield. The Primarch of the Imperial Fists understood defensive warfare the way a poet understands language, with an intuitive, almost spiritual comprehension that went beyond mere tactical calculation. Dawn was also one of the most genuinely decent beings among the Primarchs. He had no hidden agendas, no festering resentments, no secret hungers for power or recognition. Service was its own reward, and Dawn served with a purity of purpose that made him almost uniquely resistant to the temptations of chaos. Within his heart, there was simply nothing for the dark gods to latch onto. No selfish desire, no unacknowledged ambition, just the unshakable conviction that his duty was to protect humanity and the iron will to see that duty through no matter the cost. During the Horus Heresy, Dawn was entrusted with the defense of Terra itself, and the fortifications he designed around the Imperial Palace were so formidable that even the combined might of 9 traitor legions, supported by demons and dark gods and engines of war that defied description, he could not breach them before the loyalist reinforcements arrived. But the siege left scars on Dawn that never healed. He was aboard the vengeful spirit when the Emperor fell, and the sight of his father's broken body haunted him for the rest of his life. His final fate remains uncertain. He disappeared while boarding a Chaos vessel during a Black Crusade, and only his skeletal hands were ever recovered, enshrined as relics by his sons. Whether Rogel Dawn is truly dead or merely lost, or waiting somewhere in the darkness for the hour when his shield is needed once more, no one can say for certain. The angel landed on Baal Secundus, a moon orbiting the radiation-blasted world of Baal, and even the manner of his arrival seemed touched by something miraculous. The tribe that found him, the people of pure blood, discovered the infant Primarch in a glowing capsule at a place they would forever after call Angel's Fall. But the child they pulled from that cradle was not quite what the Emperor had designed. The touch of chaos during the scattering had changed Sanguinius. He bore a mutation that would have been cause for immediate execution in the later Imperium, a pair of magnificent swan-white wings that sprouted from his back and grew to a span sufficient to carry his enormous frame through the scorching desert air. The people of Baal Secundus almost killed him for it. Mutants were feared and hated on Baal, and the tribal elders debated whether the winged child was a blessing or a curse. But something about Sanguinius stayed their hands. Perhaps it was the golden light that seemed to emanate from his skin. Perhaps it was the inhuman beauty of his features, so perfect that looking upon him felt like gazing into a stained glass window of some divine being. Or perhaps it was simply the fact that, at 3 weeks old, the infant had already grown to the size of a toddler and killed a giant fire scorpion with his bare hands. Sanguinius grew into everything the Emperor could have hoped for and more. He was a warrior of incomparable skill, a leader of unmatched charisma, and a being of such profound compassion that he inspired devotion not through fear or authority, but through the simple, overwhelming force of his goodness. He united the tribes of Baal, while drove back the hordes of mutants that plagued the irradiated wastes, and was worshipped by his people as a living god, the great angel of Baal. When the emperor arrived, Sanguinius did not kneel in blind obedience. He had foreseen his father's coming through psychic visions, and he demanded that the emperor swear an oath to leave the people of Baal in peace before he would pledge his allegiance. The emperor agreed. It was the only time a Primarch negotiated terms for his compliance. Given command of the 9th Legion, the Blood Angels, Sanguinius became the most beloved figure in the entire Imperium. He was the one Primarch that every other Primarch admired. Even those who hated each other, even those who schemed and plotted and burned with jealousy, could find nothing to criticize about the angel. He fought with a grace that made violence look like prayer. He led with a warmth that made hardened killers weep with gratitude. He was, by every account and every measure, at the best of the Emperor's sons, and he knew he was going to die. Sanguinius possessed the gift, or curse, of foresight. He could see fragments of the future, and what those fragments showed him was his own death at the hands of his brother Horus, aboard the War Master's flagship during the Siege of Terra. He could have fled. He could have hidden. He could have tried to change his fate. Instead, he walked toward it with open eyes and an unbroken heart, because he understood that some battles are worth fighting, even when you know you cannot win. His death at Horus's hands became the single most defining moment of the Horus heresy, a sacrifice so profound that it created a crack in the War Master's corruption, a moment of hesitation that gave the Emperor the opening he needed to destroy his fallen son once and for all. 10,000 years later, Sanguinius is venerated across the Imperium as a saint. Temples rise in his honor beside those of the Emperor himself. A holy day called Sanguinala is celebrated across 1,000,000 worlds, where citizens wear the red badge of the angel and give thanks for the sacrifice that saved humanity from extinction. He is dead, but his memory burns brighter than any living flame. If Sanguinius represented the best of what the Primarchs could be, then Konrad Curze represented the worst of what they could become when everything went wrong from the very beginning. At the Night Haunter, as he would come to be known, landed on Nostramo, a world of perpetual darkness orbiting a dying sun whose feeble light barely reached the surface. Nostramo was a nightmare given form, a planet ruled by crime lords and corrupt plutocrats, where the vast majority of the population lived in abject poverty, worked to death in adamantium mines, while the wealthy gorged themselves on the profits. Suicide was more common than old age as a cause of death, and depression was the natural state of existence. Hope was a foreign concept. Unlike every other Primarch, Konrad Curze was not adopted by anyone. No tribe took him in. No foster parent raised him. No mentor guided his development. He was utterly alone from the moment his capsule crashed through the planet's surface and into its adamantium-rich core. He clawed his way to the surface and survived in the underhive of Nostromo Quintus by hunting feral animals and enduring conditions that would have broken any normal being in days. And from his earliest moments of consciousness, he was plagued by something that set him apart from all his brothers. Visions. Terrible, relentless visions of the darkest possible futures, waking nightmares that showed him an endless parade of suffering, betrayal, and death. Well, these visions drove Curze to an extreme that no other Primarch ever matched. He became Nostramo's self-appointed arbiter of justice, enforcing order through the only tool he understood: absolute, uncompromising terror. He hunted criminals through the darkened streets and killed them in ways so horrific that even the most hardened killers quailed at the whispered rumors of what happened to those who drew the Night Haunter's attention. And it worked. Crime on Nostramo plummeted. That the streets became safe. The ruling elite moderated their excesses, terrified that the shadow in the darkness might come for them next. Curze had brought peace to his world, but it was a peace built entirely on fear. and it would endure only as long as the source of that fear remained present. When the emperor found Kersey, the reunion was difficult. Kersey's worldview, his conviction that fear was the only reliable tool of governance, conflicted fundamentally with the emperor's vision. But he was given command of the 8th Legion, the Night Lords, and his approach to warfare was grimly effective. The Night Lords did not simply defeat their enemies. They destroyed the enemy's will to fight through campaigns of calculated terror so devastating that entire worlds would surrender rather than face what the 8th Legion would do to them if they resisted. But Kersey deteriorated. The visions never stopped. The darkness inside him grew deeper. And when he learned that Nostromo had reverted to its old ways the moment he left, that all his brutal justice had accomplished nothing lasting, something inside him shattered beyond repair. He destroyed Nostromo, ordering his fleet to fire into the planet's core until it exploded. And from that moment on, Konrad Kersey was no longer a weapon of the Imperium. He was simply a monster, doing what monsters do because he had been made to do it and could see no other way to exist. His death came at the hands of a Calidus assassin named Meshen, sent by the Imperium to execute him after the Horus heresy. Kersey let her in. He disabled his guards, opened the doors, and sat in his throne waiting for the killing blow. Some say he wanted to die. Others say he was making a point, that if the Emperor's own assassins could be sent to murder a Primarch, then the Imperium was no different from the corrupt society he had tried to purge on Nostromo. In death, as in life, as Konrad Kurz offered no comfort and no easy answers. Only the cold certainty that the universe was exactly as dark as he had always claimed it was. On the world of Medusa, a geologically volatile planet of tectonic upheaval and nomadic survival, Ferrus Manus grew strong in isolation. His capsule struck the peak of the highest mountain, and the infant survived the impact through sheer Primarch resilience. He wandered the harsh landscape alone for years, joining none of the nomadic clans that roamed Medusa's ever-shifting surface. He was a solitary figure, self-reliant to an extreme even by Primarch standards, driven by an internal compulsion to test himself against every challenge the planet could offer. His defining moment came when he tracked down and fought a colossal biomechanical creature called Acernoth, a being of living metal that dwelt in the volcanic caves beneath Medusa's surface. As the battle was legendary, even by the standards of Primarch combat, a prolonged and desperate struggle that ended only when Ferrus plunged his hands into a river of molten metal and used the superheated liquid silver to destroy the beast. But the necrodermis, the living metal of the creature's body, bonded permanently to his hands and forearms, coating them in a layer of gleaming silver that could never be removed. From that day forward, Ferrus Manus, Iron Hand, he bore his name not as a title, but as a literal description. He was a master craftsman, forging weapons of such quality that several of his brother Primarchs carried blades of his making. His closest friend among his brothers was Fulgrim of the Emperor's Children, an unlikely pairing between the iron-souled pragmatist and the beauty-obsessed perfectionist. Their friendship was genuine and deep, which made what happened later all the more devastating. At the drop site massacre on Istvan V, the defining betrayal of the Horus heresy's early stages, Fulgrim beheaded Ferrus Manus with a single stroke of a demon-possessed blade. It was the first death of a Primarch in the heresy, and it sent a shockwave through the loyalist forces that shattered morale and changed the character of the war overnight. The Iron Hands, unable to process their grief, rejected emotion entirely, as embracing cold logic and mechanical augmentation in a desperate attempt to purge the weakness of feeling from their souls. 10,000 years later, they are still running from that wound. The Iron Hands became a chapter defined by self-punishment and the rejection of human frailty. Their battle brothers systematically replaced their own limbs with bionic replacements, viewing flesh as a liability to be overcome rather than a gift to be cherished. Their philosophy, which they call the calculus of strength, reduces every decision to a cold equation of efficiency and output. Love is weakness. Grief is malfunction. Compassion is a processing error to be corrected with steel and circuitry. It is a deeply disturbing transformation, and the irony is that Ferrus Manus himself would have been horrified by it. He wore his silver hands not as badges of pride, but as reminders of his own imperfection. Yet he understood that the metal bonded to his flesh was a mark of a battle he had almost lost, a scar from a moment of desperation rather than a symbol of mechanical superiority. His sons took the wrong lesson from his legacy, and 10,000 years of compounding that error has produced a chapter that has become something their father would barely recognize. Corvus Corax, the Deliverer, the Raven Lord, Primarch of the 19th Legion, the Raven Guard. He had perhaps the most morally clear-cut origin of any Primarch. He landed on Lycaeus, a barren moon orbiting the forge world of Kievar, where the population lived in conditions of outright slavery. The tech guilds of Kievar used Lycaeus as both a mining colony and a dumping ground for political dissidents, criminals, and anyone else who inconvenienced the ruling class. The slaves worked in lightless tunnels beneath the moon's surface, extracting the minerals that fed Kievar's hungry manufactoriums, and they died in those tunnels by the thousands, their bodies disposed of with less ceremony than broken machinery. The infant Corax was found deep beneath the moon's glaciers by a team of miners who had been following a mineral seam into uncharted territory. They discovered the child in a lightless chamber, alone and newly conscious. And they did something remarkable. They hid him. They raised him in secret among the slave population, protected him from the overseers, and educated him in the principles of justice, dignity, and resistance. Many of his protectors were political radicals who had been imprisoned for advocating for workers' rights, and they poured their knowledge and their ideals into the growing Primarch, with the desperation of people who had nothing left to give except their beliefs. Corax absorbed it all. He learned to fight, obviously, because he was a Primarch and fighting was encoded in his very DNA. But he also learned to think, to plan, to wait, and to organize. He discovered that he possessed a unique psychic ability, the power to wrap himself in shadow and become effectively invisible even in plain sight. He used this ability to move freely through the mining complex, gathering intelligence on the overseers' routines, mapping the tunnel network, and making contact with potential allies among the slave population. But he organized the workers into cells, each one operating independently so that if one was compromised, the others would survive. He built weapon caches in hidden locations throughout the tunnel system. He launched a campaign of sabotage and psychological warfare that gradually weakened the overseers' grip on the population, while simultaneously building the slaves' confidence in their own ability to resist. And when the moment was right, when every piece was in position and every contingency had been planned for, Corax struck. The uprising was coordinated, devastating, and complete. Every guard on Lycaeus was killed within hours. When Kievar sent military forces to put down the rebellion, Corax was ready for them too. Using atomic mining charges, guerrilla ambushes, and a strategy of controlled chaos that kept the invaders off balance at every turn, he brought the tech guilds to their knees. The ruling class of Kievar collapsed into civil war, and both worlds were liberated. In celebration, the people of Lycaeus renamed their moon deliverance, and when the emperor came to claim his son, Corax set a condition for his allegiance. The emperor must help bring lasting peace to Kievar and end the exploitation that had produced such suffering. The emperor agreed, and the Adeptus Mechanicus was brought in to rebuild both worlds along more equitable lines. And Corax took command of the Raven Guard and fought the Great Crusade with a focus on liberation and precision. His legion specialized in covert operations, infiltration, and surgical strikes against enemy leadership. They did not fight for glory or recognition. They fought to free people, and they did it quietly, efficiently, and with a minimum of collateral damage. The heresy devastated the Raven Guard at Istvan V. Corax survived the massacre, but watched his legion nearly destroyed around him. As in desperation, he obtained the Emperor's own genetic data and attempted to create new space marines at an accelerated rate. The result was a horror. twisted, mutated creatures that were barely recognizable as human, let alone as Astartes. Corax, consumed by guilt over what he had created, eventually euthanized the mutants himself and then withdrew from the Imperium entirely, disappearing into the Eye of Terror with a single word left behind as his final message: nevermore. Within the warp, Corax has been transformed into something beyond flesh, a creature of living shadow that hunts the enemies of humanity through the impossible landscapes of the Imperium. He is known to stalk the word-bearers and their demon Primarch Lorgar with particular intensity, and whether the being that now wears Corax's name still retains any trace of the idealistic liberator who freed the slaves of Lycaeus is a question that has no easy answer. Angron's story is perhaps the most tragic of all the Primarchs, and in a saga overflowing with tragedy, that is saying something. His capsule landed on Nuceria, a civilized world ruled by a wealthy elite who kept their population docile through the same method tyrants have used since the dawn of recorded history: bread and circuses. Gladiatorial combat was the planet's primary entertainment, and the gladiators themselves were slaves, prisoners of war, all unfortunates who had been sold into the arena by families too poor to feed them. The fighters were implanted with crude cybernetic devices called the butcher's nails, neural implants that amplified aggression and dulled every sensation except the rush of combat. When you were fighting, the nails made you feel alive. When you were not fighting, they made you feel nothing but pain. The technology was crude, brutal, and irreversible. Designed not to enhance a warrior, but to break a person down into something that existed only to fight and kill. The infant Angron was found by a slaver in the mountains, surrounded by the corpses of aliens he had killed, despite being barely old enough to stand. Imperial scholars have speculated that these aliens may have been Aeldari, who had foreseen through their psychic gifts the terrible future that Angron would bring about, and had attempted to kill him before his destiny could unfold. If so, they failed, and the galaxy paid the price. The young Primarch was taken to the capital city of Deshea, sold to the ruling clan known as House Thalca, and thrown into the gladiatorial pits. The butcher's nails were hammered into his skull while he was still a child, crude spikes of metal driven into the soft tissue of his brain with no anesthetic and no concern for the damage they would cause. Whatever Angron might have been, whatever compassion or wisdom or gentleness the Emperor had coded into his genome, the nails burned it away like fire burning through parchment. There are whispered accounts, fragments preserved in the deepest archives of the Imperium, that Angron, before the implantation, possessed an extraordinary gift of empathy. Not merely the ability to understand another person's emotions, but the psychic capacity to feel the pain of others and absorb it into himself, it easing their suffering at the cost of his own comfort. If this is true, and the evidence suggests it is, then the tragedy of the butcher's nails takes on a dimension of cruelty so profound it defies comprehension. The slave masters of Nuceria took a being designed to feel the pain of others and transform it into healing, and they turned him into a creature that could feel nothing but rage. They did not merely enslave a Primarch, they butchered his soul. Despite everything, Angron found something like family among his fellow gladiators. These were men and women who had endured the same torture, who bore the same scars, who fought and bled and screamed alongside him in the arena day after day. He became their champion, their leader, and eventually their liberator. He led a slave rebellion that broke free of the arena and fled into the mountains, an army of the desperate and the damned waging a guerrilla war against the armies of the High Riders. For a time, there was hope. For a time, Angron and his brothers and sisters carved out something that resembled freedom in the wild places of Nuceria. But the slave masters of the various city-states eventually marshaled their combined military forces and surrounded Angron's diminished band of rebels. Outnumbered and outgunned, with no prospect of reinforcement or escape, Angron and his companions prepared to make their final stand on a mountain ridge above the killing fields. They were determined to die fighting for the freedom they had briefly known. It should have been a glorious death. In the ethos of the gladiator pits, to die on your feet with a weapon in your hand, and your enemies before you, was the greatest honor a slave could know. Angron had accepted this. He had made his peace with it. He was ready. And then the Emperor arrived. Not with an army to liberate the slaves, not with the power of the Imperium to tear down the slave masters and their corrupt regime. Yet he came with a teleporter, and he took Angron, just Angron. The Primarch was ripped away from the battlefield in a flash of light, transported to the Emperor's flagship, while his brothers and sisters, the only family he had ever known, the only beings in the universe who had loved him without condition or calculation, were slaughtered to the last man and woman below. The Emperor did not save them. He did not even try. To him, they were irrelevant, mere mortals whose lives held no strategic value compared to the recovery of a Primarch. To Angron, they were everything. Angron never forgave this. He never could. The Emperor had saved his body, but killed everything inside him that still believed the universe contained any justice at all. He was the only Primarch who was taken against his will, the only one who served the Emperor, not out of loyalty or love or even respect, but out of a kind of despairing, rage-fueled resignation. He was a dead man walking, and he knew it. The butcher's nails were slowly destroying his brain, eating away at the cognitive and emotional centers that made him who he was, replacing nuance and thought with an ever-narrowing corridor of fury that led nowhere except to more killing. When the heresy came, Angron did not choose chaos the way some of his brothers did, through ideology or ambition or wounded pride. He simply did not care enough about the Emperor or the Imperium to fight for them, but he had never been given a reason to care. And the killing, at least, gave him a moment's relief from the constant, screaming agony of the nails. During the heresy, Angron unleashed a campaign of bloodshed that surpassed even the worst expectations of those who had fought alongside him. He cared nothing for strategy, nothing for objectives, nothing for the political machinations that motivated his brother's betrayal. He simply killed. He killed loyalists and traitors with equal abandon, upturning his world eaters loose on any target that happened to be in their path. The legion he had been given command of had, by this point, adopted the butcher's nails themselves, every single one of them choosing to undergo the agonizing implantation that their Primarch had endured against his will. It was an act of devotion that Angron found bewildering and infuriating in equal measure. They had chosen the very torture that had been forced upon him, and in doing so, as they had transformed themselves from disciplined space marines into howling berserkers who measured glory in liters of spilt blood. The culmination of Angron's tragedy came during the Shadow Crusade, when the Word-Bearer's dark apostles performed a ritual of ascension that transformed the Red Angel into a demon prince of Khorne, the Blood God. The ritual consumed whatever remained of Angron's humanity, burning away the last fragments of the empath who had once absorbed the suffering of others and replacing them with an engine of pure, distilled rage the size of a building. The being that emerged was no longer a Primarch in any recognizable sense. It was a living avatar of slaughter, a creature whose very presence drove nearby mortals insane with bloodlust, whose footsteps scorched the earth, whose roar could shatter walls and stop hearts. 10,000 years later, as Angron returned to the material universe during the opening of the Great Rift, he manifested on the world of Malak Baal and led a demon incursion of such ferocity that it took a full deployment of Grey Knights to banish him back to the warp. His World Eaters, now a scattered warband of blood-maddened berserkers, still roam the galaxy in loose packs, falling upon Imperial worlds with no warning and no purpose beyond the Nail's insatiable demand for violence. They are the final, a terrible legacy of a Primarch who was never given the chance to become what he was meant to be, a living monument to the cruelty of those who should have protected him and the indifference of the one who claimed to be his father. On the paradise world of Macragge, Robuta Gilliman was adopted by one of the planet's two ruling consuls, a wise and benevolent statesman named Connor. Where other Primarchs grew up in savagery and deprivation, Gilliman was raised with love, education, and the tools to build rather than destroy. Macragge had survived the age of strife with its civilization mostly intact, a world of structured governance, interplanetary trade, and a functioning military. And Guilliman thrived in this environment of order and rationality. He was a prodigy in every discipline, mastering warfare and statecraft with equal facility. And when his adoptive father was murdered by a treacherous political rival named Gallen, Guilliman avenged Connor, which crushed the rebellion and rebuilt Macraga's entire social structure from the ground up. The young Primarch's approach to governance was revolutionary in its simplicity. He created a meritocracy where office and honor were earned through ability rather than birthright. He redistributed the wealth and lands that had been hoarded by the noble houses, giving ordinary citizens the opportunity to improve their lives through hard work and talent. And he established trade networks between Macragge and its neighboring worlds, creating the nucleus of what would become Ultramar, the most prosperous and well-governed region in the entire Imperium. When the Emperor arrived, he found not a warlord or a conqueror, but a builder, a Primarch who understood that the purpose of power was to create something worth defending. For 5 years before the Emperor's arrival, Macragge and the surrounding worlds had thrived under Guilliman's leadership, a small but shining example of what humanity could achieve when guided by reason and compassion rather than fear and superstition. Guilliman was given command of the 13th Legion, the Ultramarines, and he led them to become the largest and most successful legion in the Great Crusade. The Ultramarines brought hundreds of worlds into compliance, earning commendations and respect across the galaxy. But Guilliman's true genius was not military, it was organizational. But he saw patterns where others saw chaos. He built systems that could endure beyond the lifespan of any individual, institutions that would function effectively regardless of who was in charge. He understood, perhaps better than any of his brothers, that the Great Crusade would one day end, and that the Imperium would need structures of governance and military organization that could sustain it through the centuries to come. During the heresy, Guilliman was cut off from Terra by the Ruin Storm, a massive warp storm conjured by the traitors to divide the loyalist forces. Unable to reach his father, Guilliman did what came naturally. He organized. He established Imperium Secundus around the core of Ultramar, a contingency government that would preserve the Emperor's ideals if Terra fell. He convinced the Lion and Sanguinius to join him, creating a triumvirate that governed this secondary Imperium while they worked desperately to find a way through the storm. When word finally reached them that Terra still stood, Sanguinius departed first, arriving in time to confront Horus aboard the Vengeful Spirit. Guilliman gathered his forces and raced toward Terra with everything he had, driving his fleet at near impossible speeds, but arrived too late. The battle was over. Horus was dead. Sanguinius was dead. And the Emperor, the being who had been the center of Guilliman's universe, was a shattered husk interred in the Golden Throne. He alive in only the most technical sense of the word. After the Horus heresy, it was Guilliman who authored the Codex Astartes, the document that broke the legions into smaller chapters to ensure that no single commander could ever again wield the power to threaten the Imperium. It was a controversial decision that nearly sparked another civil war, as several Primarchs resisted the notion of dividing their legions, but Guilliman pressed forward. He convinced that the concentration of power in too few hands had been the fundamental vulnerability that allowed the heresy to happen. It was Guilliman who kept the Imperium from collapsing entirely in the aftermath of the Emperor's incapacitation, serving as the First Lord Commander and building the administrative structures that would govern humanity for the next 10,000 years. And then, at the Battle of Thessala, his brother Fulgrim, now a demon prince of Slaanesh, struck him down with a poisoned blade that left a wound no mortal medicine could heal. Guilliman was placed in a stasis field on the verge of death, his body displayed in the Temple of Correction on Macragge as a holy relic. For 10 millennia, pilgrims traveled across the galaxy to gaze upon the frozen form of a Primarch, some swearing that the wound was slowly healing, despite the impossibility of such a thing within an activated stasis field. In the 42nd millennium, the impossible became real. Through the combined efforts of the ancient tech priest Belisarius Cawl, the Ieldari god of the dead Ennead and the intervention of the living Saint Celestine, Guilliman was resurrected. He awoke to an Imperium that would have been unrecognizable to the man who had helped build it. The rational, secular civilization he had fought for had become a theocratic nightmare, a rotting, a superstitious empire that worshipped his father as a god and burned heretics in the same manner that the emperor himself had once forbidden. The Codex Astartes, which Guilliman had written as a flexible guide, had been ossified into religious dogma. The administrative systems he had designed for efficiency had been corrupted into instruments of oppression. He is alive, and that fact alone is a miracle of a kind. But the Imperium Guilliman has returned to is nothing like the one he fought to build. It is a rotting, theocratic nightmare, a civilization that has elevated superstition over reason and cruelty over compassion. And the Primarch, who valued rationality and justice above all things, must now navigate a galaxy that has abandoned both. It is, perhaps, the cruelest fate of all the Primarchs, to survive long enough to see everything you built transformed into a mockery of your original vision. Whilst we could spend lifetimes exploring the remaining Primarchs, and each one deserves that time. Let us give them their due, for their stories are no less vital to the grand tragedy of the Imperium than those we have already told. Mortarion, the Death Lord, Primarch of the 14th Legion, the Death Guard, grew up on the poison-shrouded world of Barbaros. It was a place that seemed designed by some malicious architect to produce suffering on an industrial scale. As Barbaros orbited near its dim yellow sun, and its surface was blanketed in toxic mists so dense and lethal that unprotected humans could survive only in the lowest valleys where the air was barely breathable. Higher up, in the mountains where the poisonous fog thickened to an opaque wall, beings of terrible power had established their dominion. These overlords were immune to the toxins that killed ordinary men, and they used the human population of the valleys below as slaves, cattle, and subjects for unspeakable experimentation. The people of Barbaros lived in a state of perpetual terror, cowering in their miserable settlements while the mountain lords sent their servants down through the fog to harvest new victims. Into this nightmare, the infant Mortarion fell. He was found not by the human population, but by one of the overlords themselves, the most powerful of them, who dwelt at the very peak of the highest mountain, where the poisons were so concentrated that even a Primarch could not survive for long without protection. This creature took the infant as a curiosity, raising him in isolation, teaching him the ways of the mountain lords while carefully ensuring that the boy never had contact with the humans below. But Mortarion's nature could not be suppressed forever. He escaped his captor and descended into the valleys, where the sight of ordinary humans suffering under the yoke of inhuman tyrants ignited something fierce and unquenchable inside him. He organized the farmers and peasants into an army, forged crude gas masks and environmental suits to protect them from the fog, and led them on a crusade up the mountainsides to destroy the overlords one by one. It was a campaign that spanned years, and with each victory, Mortarion pushed higher into the mountains where the poisons grew thicker and more deadly. Even his Primarch physiology struggled at the highest altitudes, his lungs burning, his vision blurring, his superhuman body pushed to the very edge of its tolerance. But he refused to stop. The last overlord, the creature that had raised him, waited at the summit of the tallest peak, and Mortarion swore that he would climb that mountain and destroy his former captor with his own hands, or die trying. He nearly died trying. The Emperor arrived on Barbaros as Mortarion lay choking and delirious on the upper slopes, barely conscious, his body racked by poisons that would have killed any lesser being 100 times over. The Emperor ascended the peak that Mortarion could not, slew the Overlord without apparent difficulty, and descended to offer his hand to the gasping, humiliated Primarch below. Mortarion accepted, because he had no other choice. But he never forgave the Emperor for stealing his victory. That was his mountain, his enemy, his fight, and the Emperor had taken it from him with the casual ease of a parent solving a puzzle that had defeated a child. The bitterness of that stolen triumph would poison Mortarion's soul, just as surely as the mists of Barbarous had poisoned his lungs. And when the time came to choose sides in the heresy, the Death Lord chose the darkness. Vulcan, the Lord of Drakes, Primarch of the 18th Legion, the Salamanders, landed on Nocturne, a volcanic death world where the crust was in a state of near constant upheaval. Eruptions could reshape entire continents overnight, and the human population had adapted to this reality by building nothing permanent, living in settlements that could be abandoned and reconstructed within days. They were a hardy people, blacksmiths and artisans who had learned to work with the volcanic metals that their world produced in abundance, and they faced the regular predations of monstrous fire drakes, as enormous reptilian beasts that emerged from the volcanic vents to hunt human prey. Vulcan was found and raised by a blacksmith, and this seemingly simple detail had a profound effect on the Primarchs' development. Where other Primarchs were raised by kings, warlords, or in conditions of brutal savagery, Vulcan grew up in a community that valued creation over destruction, cooperation over competition, and the protection of the weak over the glorification of the strong. But he became the finest craftsman on Nocturne, forging weapons and tools of such quality that they were considered works of art. And he fought the fire drakes not for glory, but to protect the settlements that could not defend themselves. His people loved him with a warmth and sincerity that few Primarchs ever experienced, and he loved them back with a tenderness that seemed almost impossible in a being engineered for war. When the Emperor came to Nocturne, he did not announce himself, and he arrived disguised as a common traveler and participated in the great hunting festival that the people of Nocturne held every year to cull the fire drake population. The Emperor and Vulcan hunted side by side, each bringing down larger and more dangerous prey than the other, in a competition that escalated until both were pursuing the largest and most fearsome drake on the planet. Both killed their quarry at nearly the same instant, but as they stood over the body of the beast, and a volcanic eruption triggered a massive tidal wave of lava that swept toward a nearby settlement. Without hesitation, Vulcan turned from the hunt and ran to save the civilians, carrying as many as he could to safety, while the lava consumed everything in its path. The Emperor watched this act of selfless heroism and declared Vulcan the winner of the contest, not because his kill was larger, but because he had chosen to save lives rather than claim trophies. Vulcan knelt, and his legion, while the Salamanders would forever reflect his values, fighting not merely for victory, but for the people that victory was meant to protect. There is another detail about Vulcan that sets him apart from all his brothers. He is a perpetual. Like the Emperor himself, Vulcan cannot truly die. He can be killed, his body destroyed, his organs shattered, his flesh burned to ash, but he will always return, always regenerate, always come back from whatever oblivion has claimed him. But this gift has been both a blessing and a curse. During the heresy, Vulcan was captured by the traitor Primarch Conrad Curze, who subjected him to an extended campaign of torture so horrific that it drove the Lord of Drakes temporarily insane. Curze killed Vulcan repeatedly, in every manner he could devise, and watched in fascination as the Primarch regenerated each time. The psychological damage of dying and being reborn over and over, as of knowing that even death cannot provide escape from suffering, left scars on Vulcan that no amount of perpetual regeneration could heal. Magnus the Red grew up on Prospero, and his story is perhaps the most classically tragic of all the Primarchs, a tale of a brilliant mind undone by the very brilliance that made it extraordinary. Prospero was a world of outcasts and scholars, as a planet settled by psychically gifted humans who had fled persecution on other worlds to build a civilization devoted to the study and mastery of the mind's hidden potential. The capital city of Tizca was a marvel of architecture and learning, a city of gleaming white marble spires and vast libraries where knowledge was revered above all other things. Into this environment, the infant Magnus fell, and he was accepted immediately as one of their own, as a prodigious psyker whose abilities dwarfed those of even the most gifted human sorcerers. Magnus was a giant, even by Primarch standards, towering over his brothers, with a mane of flame-red hair and a single great eye that burned with the light of the warp itself. Whether he had always possessed only one eye or lost the other in some early bargain with the denizens of the Imperium is a matter of debate that even the most learned scholars cannot resolve. What is certain is that Magnus possessed psychic powers of a magnitude that no other Primarch could match. He could project his consciousness across the galaxy, peer into the future, manipulate matter with his thoughts, and commune with entities in the warp whose nature and intentions defied mortal comprehension. To Magnus, the warp was not something to be feared. It was a frontier to be explored, a vast ocean of possibility that humanity could learn to navigate and harness for the betterment of all. He studied it with the rigor of a scientist and the passion of an artist, cataloguing its currents and creatures, developing techniques for the safe manipulation of its energies, and training his 1,000 sons, the 15th Legion, in the disciplined use of psychic warfare. He believed, with absolute conviction, that knowledge was always preferable to ignorance, and that the suppression of psychic powers was not merely foolish but dangerous, driving gifted individuals underground where they were far more likely to fall prey to the corrupting influence of the warp's darker residents. This conviction put him on a direct collision course with the Emperor. At the Council of Nicaea, a great convocation called to debate the use of psychic powers within the legions. Magnus argued passionately for the continued study and application of sorcery. He was overruled. The Emperor issued an edict banning the use of psychic powers by the Space Marine legions and ordered the dissolution of the Librarius divisions that had served in many legions. Magnus was devastated, convinced that his father was making a catastrophic mistake. And when Magnus later discovered Horus's treachery through psychic means, he broke the Edict of Nicaea to send a warning to the Emperor, thus projecting a psychic message directly into the Imperial Palace on Terra. The message arrived, but the spell Magnus used to send it was so powerful that it shattered the carefully constructed psychic wards the Emperor had erected around his secret webway project, tearing a hole in reality beneath the palace and flooding the tunnels with demons. The Emperor's greatest work was destroyed in an instant, and the price would be measured in millennia of suffering. Now furious at what he perceived as a deliberate act of sabotage, the Emperor dispatched Lim and Russ and his space wolves to bring Magnus to Terra in chains. But the orders were tampered with, likely by Horus himself, and Russ arrived at Prospero not to arrest Magnus, but to destroy him. The burning of Prospero was one of the most devastating and tragic engagements of the entire heresy. It's a battle between two loyalist forces manipulated into attacking each other by the very enemy they should have been united against. Tizca was reduced to rubble, the 1,000 sons were shattered, and Magnus, broken and betrayed, accepted the patronage of Tzeentch, the chaos god of change, sorcery, and forbidden knowledge. The Crimson King had sought only to help, and the universe had punished him for it. Or whether he was a victim of circumstance or the architect of his own destruction depends entirely on which side of the debate you stand on, and that ambiguity is precisely what makes his story so compelling. Lorgar Aurelian found his way to Colchis, a world steeped in religious devotion, and grew up to become the most fanatical believer among the Primarchs. He was found as an infant by a priest named Cor Phaeron, or a man who recognized the child's extraordinary nature and raised him in the traditions of the Covenant, the dominant religious order of Colchis. Cor Phaeron was not a kind man. He was manipulative, physically abusive, and interested in Lorgar primarily as a tool for his own advancement. But Lorgar's devotion transcended the cruelty of his upbringing, and he absorbed the religious teachings of Colchis with the fervor of a true believer, and eventually came to the conclusion that the many gods worshipped by the Covenant were merely aspects of a single, supreme deity. When the Emperor arrived on Colchis, Lorgar recognized him immediately as the god he had been seeking his entire life. He fell to his knees and wept with the joy of a pilgrim who has finally reached the end of a long and painful journey. Lorgar worshipped the Emperor as a god with an intensity that made even his most devout brothers uncomfortable. He built cathedrals on every world the word-bearers brought into compliance. He wrote scriptures proclaiming the Emperor's divinity. He converted populations not through military force, but through the sheer, overwhelming power of his oratory, delivering sermons so moving that entire civilizations laid down their weapons and embraced the imperial faith. But his Great Crusade was a religious mission, a holy war conducted with prayer and scripture alongside bolter and blade, and the word-bearers were the slowest legion in the crusade, because Lorgar refused to move on from a world until its population had been thoroughly and completely converted. The emperor was not pleased. He did not want to be worshipped. The imperial truth, the founding philosophy of the Imperium, whilst explicitly rejected all forms of religious belief as superstitious nonsense that held humanity back from its true potential. When the emperor's patience finally ran out, he ordered the Ultramarines, Guilliman's own legion, to raise the city of Monarchia, the most perfect expression of Lorgar's devotion, and forced the entire Wordbearer's legion to kneel in the ashes while their father publicly rebuked them for their failure. It was a humiliation of such magnitude that it broke something fundamental inside Lorgar. The god he had worshipped had rejected his love. The faith that had sustained him since childhood had been declared a lie, and in the void left by that shattered devotion, darker things began to grow. Guided by Corphaeron and Erebus, both of whom had secretly maintained their worship of the old chaos-aligned gods of Colchis, Lorgar embarked on a pilgrimage into the Eye of Terror. There, he witnessed the truth of the warp, the existence of the chaos gods, and the primordial truth that the universe was far stranger and more dangerous than the imperial truth acknowledged. He emerged a changed being, his faith redirected toward entities who not only accepted his worship, but actively rewarded it. Lorgar became the first Primarch to fall to chaos, and he used his extraordinary gift for persuasion and manipulation to orchestrate the corruption of Horus, setting in motion the cascade of events that would become the Horus Heresy. Corvus Corax landed on the moon of Lycaeus, a mining colony ruled by brutal tech guilds who worked their enslaved population to death in the planet's mineral-rich tunnels. Corax grew up among the prisoners and outcasts, learning the arts of stealth, guerrilla warfare, and asymmetric combat. He was a creature of shadows from the very beginning, pale-skinned and raven-haired, with eyes as dark as the spaces between stars. Or where other Primarchs dominated through physical power or towering charisma, Corax excelled at being unseen. He could move through a crowded room without anyone noticing his presence. He could cross a battlefield without leaving a trace. He could appear at your shoulder like a ghost and whisper words that changed the course of history before vanishing again into the darkness that seemed to follow him everywhere. On Lycaeus, these abilities made him the perfect revolutionary, as he organized the enslaved miners into a resistance movement, training them in the hit-and-run tactics that would become the signature of his Raven Guard Legion. The rebellion he led was not a frontal assault on the tech guild's power. It was a systematic dismantling of their infrastructure, a campaign of sabotage and precision strikes that targeted supply lines, communication networks, and key personnel until the entire ruling structure collapsed under the weight of its own paranoia. When the dust settled, Corax stood as the liberator of Lycaeus, and in his first act as its new leader, he renamed the Moon Deliverance. The Emperor found in Corax a son whose methods complemented the more direct approaches of his brothers. The Raven Guard, the 19th Legion, became masters of reconnaissance, infiltration, and rapid strike operations. They hit the enemy where they were weakest, gathered intelligence that other legions would use to plan their campaigns, and disappeared before the enemy could bring their full force to bear. They were not the largest or the most celebrated legion, but they were among the most consistently effective, accomplishing objectives that would have been impossible for more conventionally minded forces. The massacre at Isstvan V nearly destroyed the Raven Guard entirely. The Drop Site Massacre, as it came to be known, was the defining act of treachery in the Horus Heresy's early stages, as a trap designed by Horus to cripple the Loyalist legions before they could organize a coherent response. 3 legions, the Raven Guard, the Salamanders, and the Iron Hands, were lured into a frontal assault against the traitor positions on Istvan V, only to discover that 4 more legions, supposedly allies who were advancing in the second wave of the attack, were in fact traitors themselves. Caught between the hammer and the anvil, the 3 loyalist legions were devastated. Ferrus Manus was killed, Vulcan was captured, and Corax led the shattered remnants of his Raven Guard on a desperate fighting retreat that left the once proud legion reduced to a fraction of its former strength. In desperation, Corax turned to the Emperor's own genetic archives, attempting to use accelerated gene-forging techniques to rebuild his legion. The results were catastrophic. The rushed process produced warriors who were physically capable but horrifically mutated, our creatures that bore only a passing resemblance to Space Marines and whose mental stability deteriorated rapidly. Corax was forced to euthanize his own creations, an act of mercy that left psychological wounds that never healed. After the heresy's conclusion, Corax locked himself in his tower on Deliverance for a year and a day. When he emerged, he spoke a single word: nevermore. Then he boarded his ship and set course for the Eye of Terror, disappearing into the warp to wage a solitary war against the traitor legions. Some accounts suggest he found Lorgar there, and the 2 Primarchs battled in the depths of that nightmare dimension. Others claim Corax has been transformed by the warp itself, twisted into something that is no longer entirely human, but remains driven by an unquenchable hunger for vengeance against those who betrayed the Imperium. And then there is Alfarius Omegon, the last Primarch recovered, and the most enigmatic of them all. The twin Primarchs of the Alpha Legion operated in such deep secrecy that even their loyalties remain unclear 10,000 years after the heresy. They were the smallest of the Primarchs physically, close enough in stature to their own Space Marines that they could move among them undetected, switching identities and positions at will. This was not a limitation but a deliberate strategy. Where other Primarchs towered over their warriors and led from the front through the sheer force of their presence, Alfarius and Omegon became invisible, interchangeable components of a legion designed from the ground up to operate through deception, misdirection, and wheels within wheels. The very circumstances of their discovery are disputed. The official account states that Alfarius was the last Primarch found by the Emperor, but Alfarius himself claimed otherwise, asserting that he was actually the first to be recovered, having landed on Terra itself after the scattering. According to this version of events, the Emperor kept Alfarius's existence secret, using him as a hidden agent while publicly presenting Horus as his first found son. Whether this account is true, partially true, or a complete fabrication designed to sow confusion is impossible to determine, which is precisely the point. With the Alpha Legion, truth itself becomes a weapon, and certainty is a luxury their enemies are never permitted to enjoy. The Alpha Legion fought through deception, infiltration, and misdirection, and their true allegiance during the heresy, whether they served the Emperor through treachery or betrayed him through loyalty, remains one of the galaxy's most enduring mysteries. There is a legend that before the heresy, Alfarius and Omegon were contacted by a Xenos organization called the Cabal, which showed them a vision of 2 possible futures, one in which Horus won the heresy and humanity slowly destroyed itself alongside chaos, cleansing the galaxy of both, and one in which the Emperor won and the Imperium endured for thousands of years as a decaying, suffering monument to stagnation. The Cabal urged the twins to side with Horus to achieve the first future, the extinction of humanity as a sacrifice to destroy chaos forever. Whether the twins accepted this logic, rejected it, or played their own game entirely is a question that has no definitive answer. Alfarius was reportedly killed by Rogel Dawn during the Battle of Pluto, cleaved in 2 by the Imperial Fist's Primarch in a battle that occurred during the Solar War. But with the Alpha Legion, nothing is ever certain. The warrior Dawn killed may not have been the real Alfarius. Even if it was, Omegon may still survive, operating under his brother's name. are executing plans that were set in motion 10,000 years ago and have yet to reach their conclusion. The question of whether Omegon lives and what designs he might be weaving across the millennia is one that may never receive a definitive answer. And perhaps that uncertainty is the Alpha Legion's greatest weapon of all. 2 empty plinths stand in the halls of the Imperial Palace, their surfaces bare of inscription, their stories erased from every record and every memory. The 2nd and the 11th Primarchs were found. At least some evidence suggests as much. But whatever happened to them was so terrible or so shameful that the Emperor ordered their very existence scrubbed from history. Even their brother Primarchs, those who remember them at all, speak of them only in whispers and half-formed allusions. Rogel Dawn once described their empty plinths as tragedies that should have been warnings. Yi Lehman Russ hinted that his space wolves may have been involved in the elimination of at least one, but the truth has been buried so deep and guarded so fiercely that it may never surface. They are the great silence at the heart of the Primarch story, the 2 missing notes in a symphony of glory and tragedy that spans the entire galaxy. What makes this mystery so compelling is not just what was done, but who did the erasing. The Emperor himself decreed that the 2 lost brothers be forgotten, and their statues were removed from the gallery of Primarchs. Their names were struck from every record. Their legions were dissolved, and there are strong hints that the surviving Astartes of those legions were quietly absorbed into other forces, most likely the Ultramarines, whose ranks mysteriously swelled on more than one occasion following the disappearance of a legion. If this is true, then there are entire Space Marine chapters fighting in the 41st Millennium who carry the gene seed of the lost Primarchs without ever knowing it, their true heritage hidden behind 10,000 years of silence and enforced ignorance. The remaining Primarchs were forbidden to speak of their lost brothers, and most obeyed this command with varying degrees of reluctance. Lorgar made several references to them before his own fall to chaos, noting that the Emperor had ordered them to be forgotten. During one particularly revealing moment, a conversation between Magnus the Red and Lorgar suggests that both Horus and Fulgrim had sworn oaths never to speak of the 2 missing brothers, oaths they apparently honored even after turning traitor. Whatever happened was traumatic enough to silence even those Primarchs who had abandoned every other oath they ever took. Some theorists believe that the 2 lost Primarchs committed crimes of such magnitude that even the Emperor's tolerance was exhausted. Others suggest that they were too dangerous to be allowed to live, that some flaw in their creation or some corruption acquired during the scattering made them existential threats to the Imperium itself. A few more radical interpretations hold that the lost Primarchs were not destroyed at all, but hidden away, locked in stasis or imprisoned in some secret facility, held in reserve against a threat so terrible that even the Emperor was not certain he could face it alone. The truth is that Games Workshop has deliberately kept this mystery unsolved, and they have stated publicly that they intend to keep it that way. The 2 lost Primarchs are a deliberate gap in the narrative, a space where players and fans can insert their own stories, their own chapters, their own interpretations of what might have happened. It is a blank canvas in a setting that is otherwise painted in exhaustive detail, and there is something powerful about that emptiness, something that speaks to the human fascination with the unknown and the forbidden. There is one more thread we need to follow before we bring this story to its close, and that is the order in which the Primarchs were found. All because that order shaped the dynamics of the entire Brotherhood in ways that cannot be overstated. Horus was found first, and the significance of this cannot be overstated. For roughly 30 years, he was the Emperor's only son, the sole heir to a galactic empire in the making. During those 3 decades, Horus fought at his father's side, learned at his feet, earned his trust and his affection in ways that no later found Primarch could ever replicate. This relationship, this exclusive bond between father and firstborn, was the bedrock of Horus's identity. He was the favorite, the chosen one, the son who knew his father best and was known best in return. When the other Primarchs were found, one by one, that exclusive bond was diluted. Horus had to share his father's attention with brothers he had never asked for, and while he welcomed most of them with genuine warmth and generosity, there was always a part of him that remembered what it had been like to be the only one. The subsequent discoveries unfolded across roughly 2 centuries, and the order in which they occurred created a subtle but powerful hierarchy among the Primarchs. Those found earlier had more time to bond with the Emperor and with each other, to establish their legions and prove themselves on the field of battle. Those found later were always playing catch-up, or always trying to prove that they belonged in a brotherhood that had already been forming without them. Most Primarchs recognized the Emperor on sight and pledged their allegiance immediately. Something in their genetic programming, some deep-coded recognition of their creator, triggered an instinctive response that transcended rational thought. They looked upon the Emperor and knew, with a certainty that bypassed the conscious mind entirely, that this was their father. Sanguinius was one of these, his reunion with the Emperor marked by an instant and willing submission that some have compared to a religious experience. Guilliman was another, his meeting with the Emperor a partnership of kindred minds that immediately began producing dividends for the Imperium. But not all reunions went smoothly. Lemon Russ, Ferrus Manus, and Vulcan all required the Emperor to prove himself worthy through contests of strength or skill before they would agree to serve. These challenges were not acts of disrespect but expressions of their adoptive cultures, worlds where leadership was earned through demonstrated excellence rather than claimed through authority. The Emperor accepted each challenge and proved himself in each case, earning the loyalty of 3 of his most formidable sons through the language they best understood. And then there was Angron, the one Primarch who never chose to serve, who was forced into the Emperor's service against his will, torn from the battlefield, where he intended to die alongside his gladiator brothers, and pressed into a role he never wanted and never accepted. The Emperor's decision to teleport Angron away from Nuceria rather than save his companions remains one of the most controversial acts in Imperial history, and it set the stage for a betrayal that was, in some ways, the most understandable of all the traitor Primarch's motivations. Angron did not fall to temptation. Yes, he did not succumb to pride or ambition or religious fanaticism. He simply turned his fury against the man who had taken everything from him and called it mercy. The rediscovery process revealed something else about the Emperor that his sons would struggle with for the rest of their lives: his fundamental inability or unwillingness to connect with them as a father rather than a commander. He found them, gave them legions, assigned them missions, and expected them to perform. But he rarely, if ever, sat with them, talked with them, shared his thoughts and dreams with them in the way that a father shares with a son. When asked why he allowed the Primarchs to call him father, the Emperor reportedly told the story of Pinocchio, the puppet who wished to become a real boy, and explained that it was natural for any creation to refer to its creator as father. It was a revealing analogy, one that suggested the Emperor viewed his sons as constructs rather than children, as tools that had developed the inconvenient habit of wanting to be loved. This emotional distance was the crack in the foundation upon which the entire Imperium was built. The Primarchs needed a father and received a commander. They needed understanding and received orders. They needed love and received purpose. And when the Chaos Gods came whispering, offering to fill the void that the Emperor had left empty, half of them listened. Not because they were weak, but because they were starving. During the Great Crusade itself, the relationships between the Primarchs formed a web of alliances, rivalries, and misunderstandings that would shape the course of the heresy in ways none of them anticipated. Some brothers were close, bound by shared temperament or complementary strengths. Horus and Sanguinius shared a bond of genuine affection, the War Master's charisma finding a natural mirror in the angel's grace. As Fulgrim and Ferrus Manus forged a friendship rooted in their shared love of craftsmanship, the perfectionist and the pragmatist spending long hours together in the forges, debating the nature of beauty and function. Guilliman and Dawn respected each other as fellow builders and organizers, 2 sons who understood that empires were sustained by systems, rather than by the heroics of exceptional individuals. The lion and Russ despised each other from the moment they met, their first encounter reportedly ending in a brawl that lasted for days, though the reasons for their mutual animosity have never been satisfactorily explained. Other relationships were defined by tension so thick it could have been cut with a chainsword. Perturabo resented Dawn with a bitterness that bordered on obsession, convinced that the Imperial fists received praise for building what the Iron Warriors had been forced to create in far worse conditions, with far less recognition. Korax found Kurz's methods repugnant, seeing in the Night Haunter a twisted reflection of his own commitment to justice, perverted into something monstrous and indefensible. Mortarion and Magnus clashed repeatedly over the use of psychic powers, the Death Lord's visceral hatred of sorcery finding a perfect target in the Crimson King's enthusiastic embrace of it. Lorgar loved all his brothers with the indiscriminate fervor of a zealot, but that love was rarely returned with equal intensity, and the distance between his feelings and their reception hollowed him out from the inside. The Great Crusade was supposed to unite these brothers in shared purpose, to give them a common cause grand enough to subsume their individual differences and channel their collective brilliance toward a single, shining goal. And for a time, it worked. For roughly 2 centuries, the Primarchs and their legions swept across the galaxy, reclaiming lost colonies, destroying alien empires, and knitting humanity back together under a single banner. They brought order to worlds that had known only anarchy. They built roads between the stars and lit beacons in the void that guided ships through the madness of the warp. They were, for all their flaws, the greatest force for human progress the galaxy had ever seen. But the Crusade also created the conditions for its own destruction. The endless warfare brutalized brothers who might otherwise have remained whole. Thus, the competition for conquests and glory exacerbated rivalries that a wiser father would have recognized and diffused. The Emperor's decision to withdraw from the Crusade and entrust it to Horus created a power vacuum that inflamed jealousies and insecurities across the entire Brotherhood. And beneath it all, the Chaos Gods watched and waited, patient as only immortal entities can be, identifying the cracks in each Primarch's armor and preparing the whispers that would eventually pry them apart. On looking back across the sweep of their collective saga, it becomes clear that the Primarchs were never simply weapons or generals or conquering heroes. They were people, flawed, brilliant, wounded, magnificent people who were created to be instruments of a grand design, but who could not escape the very human emotions that their father either could not or would not understand. The Emperor made them to be his tools, and he was surprised when they developed feelings about being treated as tools. Yet he designed them to lead, and he was caught off guard when they started wanting to lead on their own terms. He engineered them to be superhuman, and he seemed genuinely puzzled when they suffered from very human problems like jealousy, insecurity, resentment, loneliness, and the desperate need to be loved. Consider what the Emperor himself said when asked by the tech savant Arkan Land why he allowed the Primarchs to call him father. He told the ancient story of a puppet named Pinocchio who wished to become a real boy, and explained that it was only natural for a creation to refer to its creator as father. In that one seemingly casual response lies the entire tragedy of the Primarch project. The Emperor viewed his sons as creations, not children. He acknowledged their use of the word father as a psychological inevitability, not as an expression of a genuine relationship. He could analyze their emotions with perfect clinical precision, and yet remained utterly blind to the damage that his emotional distance was causing. He was, in many ways, the most brilliant and the most obtuse being who ever lived, a creature of such vast intelligence that he could engineer demigods from his own DNA, but could not fathom why those demigods might need something as simple as a father's love. The Horus heresy was not simply a military conflict, it was a family collapse on a galactic scale, a war between brothers who had been raised in isolation, reunited under pressure, and then subjected to the crushing expectations of a father who viewed them as components in a machine, rather than sons who needed guidance and affection. Every single one of the traitor Primarchs, can trace the roots of their betrayal to wounds that were inflicted long before the first shot of the heresy was fired. Our Horus was corrupted because his love for the Emperor was so absolute that it could not survive the discovery that the Emperor did not love him back in the same way. Angron was taken against his will and never given a reason to care about the cause he was forced to serve. Lorgar was publicly humiliated for the sin of loving his father too much. Perturabo was used up and discarded without acknowledgement. Magnus was punished for trying to help. Our Mortarion was robbed of the victory that should have been his defining moment. Fulgrim was consumed by the very drive for perfection that had once been his greatest strength. Conrad Kurz was left alone in the dark, with nothing but nightmares for company. The heresy itself burned across the galaxy for 7 years, a span of time that might seem brief by the standards of a civilization that measured its history in millennia, but which contained more suffering, more destruction, and more betrayal than most species experience in their entire existence. Worlds that had been brought into compliance through decades of careful diplomacy were reduced to burning husks in hours. Populations that had been taught to revere the Emperor as their savior watched in disbelief as his own sons tore each other apart across their skies. The Astronomicon, the psychic beacon that allowed Imperial ships to navigate the warp, half flickered and dimmed as the galaxy's infrastructure collapsed around it. Supply chains failed, communication networks went dark, entire sectors were cut off from the rest of the Imperium, left to fend for themselves against enemies both external and internal. Civilization, in any meaningful sense of the word, simply stopped functioning across vast stretches of human-occupied space. The war culminated in the Siege of Terra, and a confrontation so apocalyptic that it reshaped the physical and spiritual landscape of humanity's homeworld forever. Horus brought his traitor legions to the cradle of the Imperium and launched an assault that tested every wall, every gun, every warrior that Rogel Dawn had positioned in defense of the Imperial Palace. The fighting lasted for weeks, each day more terrible than the last, each night bringing horrors that made the previous day's carnage look merciful by comparison. Demons walked the streets of the throne world alongside traitor Astartes. The sky itself tore open as the warp bled through the weakened veil of reality, raining fire and madness down on defenders and attackers alike. The walls that Dawn had built held but barely, and with each breach that was sealed and each assault that was repelled, the cost in loyalist lives grew steeper. Sanguinius fell first, or rather, he fell last among those who could have been saved. But the angel knew he was going to die. His prophetic visions had shown him this moment for years, the confrontation with Horus aboard the vengeful spirit, the inevitability of his own death. He could have avoided it. He could have stayed behind the walls, protected by his legion, letting others face the War Master in his place. Instead, he flew to the vengeful spirit and confronted Horus alone, knowing with absolute certainty that he would not survive the encounter. Some accounts say he wanted to reach whatever remained of his brother beneath the corruption, to pull Horus back from the abyss through sheer force of love and shared memory. Others say he simply wanted to weaken the War Master enough to give the Emperor a fighting chance. What is known is that Sanguinius fought with everything he had, every ounce of his angelic power, every technique he had mastered over centuries of warfare, and it was not enough. Horus killed him, us snapping the angel's back across his knee and letting the most beloved of all the Primarchs fall broken to the deck of the warship that had once been the pride of the Imperium. The Emperor arrived moments later, and the battle that followed was the defining event of human history. Two beings of such unfathomable power that their struggle warped the fabric of reality around them, father and firstborn son, locked in a combat that would determine the fate of every living soul in the galaxy. The Emperor held back at first, unwilling or unable to destroy the son he had loved above all others. But when he saw what Horus had done to Sanguinius, when he looked upon the broken body of the angel and understood the depth of the War Master's corruption, something inside the Emperor changed. He unleashed the full measure of his psychic might in a single devastating blow that annihilated Horus utterly, body and soul. ensuring that not even the Chaos Gods could resurrect their puppet. But the effort cost the Emperor everything. He was mortally wounded, his body broken beyond any mortal healer's ability to repair. Rogel Dawn carried his father's shattered form back to the Imperial Palace and installed him upon the Golden Throne, a device originally designed to power the Webway project, but now repurposed as a life support system of incomprehensible scale. The Emperor has sat upon that throne for 10,000 years, neither alive nor dead. Yet his psychic power, sustaining the Astronomicon and holding closed the Webway breach beneath the palace that would otherwise flood Terra with demons. Every day, 1,000 psychers are fed into the Golden Throne to sustain the Emperor's failing power, their souls consumed as fuel for the beacon that keeps the Imperium's shipping lanes open. It is a sacrifice of staggering magnitude, a daily harvest of human lives that would have horrified the Emperor in his prime, but which is now considered a necessary and even holy act by the institutions that govern in his name. He is worshipped as a god by the very Imperium that he founded on the principle that there are no gods, a final irony so bitter that it would have made Lorgar weep with vindication. The Imperial Creed, the state religion that permeates every level of Imperial society, teaches that the Emperor is the one true god of mankind, that his Primarchs were divine angels sent to deliver humanity from the darkness, and that the Horus heresy was a cosmic battle between good and evil rather than the family tragedy it actually was. The truth, as is so often the case in the 41st millennium, has been buried beneath layers of myth and propaganda so thick that it would take an archaeologist of extraordinary skill to excavate anything resembling an honest account of what actually happened. The scouring that followed the siege of Terra was almost as devastating as the heresy itself. The Loyalist forces, led by Guilliman, Dawn, Russ, the Khan, Corax, and Vulcan, pursued the fleeing traitor legions across the galaxy in a campaign of vengeance and retribution that lasted for years. Worlds were burned, traitor strongholds were destroyed, the remnants of the 9 traitor legions were driven into the Eye of Terror, that wound in reality where the warp bleeds into the material universe. Where the Chaos Gods offered sanctuary to their broken servants. It was during the scouring that many of the Loyalist Primarchs met their final fates, one by one, departing the stage through death, disappearance, or self-imposed exile until none remained to guide the Imperium they had bled to save. And the Loyalists? They suffered too, each in their own way. Dawn was crushed by the weight of defending an Imperium that could not be saved from its own corruption. And the guilt of failing to protect his father drove him to seek penance through pain. Russ was haunted by the violence he had committed in the Emperor's name, tormented by the knowledge that his assault on Prospero may have been a terrible mistake orchestrated by the very enemy he was trying to fight. Sanguinius walked willingly into a death he had foreseen, sacrificing himself for a father who had created him to be sacrificed, and his blood now runs through the veins of every blood angel, and carrying with it a curse of berserker rage that echoes his final moments of fury. The lion slept for 10,000 years in the heart of a shattered world, surrounded by the secrets and betrayals that had defined his life, awakening to find himself in a galaxy where nothing he remembered still existed. Corax disappeared into the darkness to wage a war that may never end, consumed by guilt over the mutated creatures he had been forced to create and destroy. Vulcan died and was reborn and died again, over and over, because even death could not release him from his duty. The Khan vanished into the Webway, chasing an enemy through twisted corridors that may have no end. And Guilliman returned from the edge of death only to discover that the Imperium he had built had become everything he had fought against. They were the brightest lights in the galaxy, and their fall into darkness was the most devastating event in human history. And they were demigods and monsters, heroes and villains, brothers and enemies. They were everything humanity could aspire to be, and everything humanity should fear becoming. And their story, for all its scope and grandeur, comes down to the simplest and most universal of all human truths. That even the most powerful beings in existence need something more than purpose and duty. They need to be understood, They need to be valued. They need, in the end, to be loved. And when that love is absent or conditional or mistaken for something it is not, the consequences can burn brighter than a dying star and last longer than the memory of any mortal mind. The Primarchs are gone now. Some are dead, some are lost. Some are transformed beyond recognition into creatures of the warp that would horrify the men they once were. 2 have returned to the material realm. Guilliman, who rules as Imperial Regent and Lord Commander from a throne he never wanted, is navigating a decaying empire that mockingly mirrors his worst nightmares, and Lionel Johnson, who awoke from 10,000 years of slumber in a mysterious realm called Mirror Caliban, reclaimed the Emperor's shield, and now walks the dark half of the galaxy known as Imperium Nihilus, battling the enemies of humanity with the same silent, secretive determination that defined him in life. The others linger as legends, as warnings, as promises of either salvation or damnation, depending on which stories you choose to believe. Somewhere in the warp, Magnus sits upon a throne of sorcerous power, his single eye burning with knowledge that would drive lesser minds to madness. Mortarion spreads his plague from the Garden of Nurgle, a rotting king of a rotting domain. Angron roars through the night with his world-eaters at his back, on a red storm of fury and bloodshed that can now manifest in real space, thanks to the opening of the Great Rift. Fulgrim wallows in excess on his pleasure world, a creature of impossible beauty and impossible cruelty. Perturabo broods behind the walls of his demon world Medrengard, building and destroying and building again in an eternal cycle that mirrors his own tormented psyche. And Lorgar meditates in his temple on Sikaris, the priest who brought the galaxy to its knees, while waiting for the moment when his dark gods call him forth once more. But their legacy endures in every Space Marine chapter that carries their gene seed, in every tradition and ritual and battle cry that echoes through the corridors of fortress monasteries across 1,000,000 worlds. The Blood Angels still carry the curse of the Black Rage, a genetic echo of Sanguinius's final moments of fury against Horus. When the Black Rage takes hold, a Blood Angel relives the death of his Primarch with such psychic intensity that he no longer recognizes the present, seeing every enemy as Horus and every battlefield as the deck of the vengeful spirit. These fallen brothers are organized into the Death Company, clad in black armor and unleashed upon the enemy in a final, glorious charge that none of them are expected to survive. It is a mercy killing dressed in the language of honor, and every Blood Angel knows that the rage may claim him at any moment, that the genetic memory of his father's death is a ticking bomb buried in his very blood. The Dark Angels still hunt the fallen, those members of their legion who turned traitor during the betrayal of Luther on Caliban. 10,000 years later, the existence of these fallen angels remains the Dark Angels' most closely guarded secret. A shame so deep that they will abandon active war zones, betray the trust of allies, and even allow Imperial citizens to die rather than risk its exposure. Their successor chapters, the so-called Unforgiven, share this obsession and the inner circle that coordinates the hunt across hundreds of worlds and thousands of years. It is an irony that the most loyal of the Primarchs produced a legacy defined by secrecy and paranoia. But then, the Lion was always a creature of shadows, and his sons have inherited that darkness along with his gene seed. The Space Wolves still howl at the stars and drink and fight and tell stories of their absent father, their fortress monastery on Fenris, a place of warmth and brotherhood amidst the planet's eternal winter. The Imperial Fists still build fortresses and stand on walls and refuse to break. Their pain gauntlets and scrimshaw rituals a constant reminder that duty comes at a cost that must be paid willingly. The Ultramarines still organize and govern and try to hold the Imperium together through sheer, bureaucratic willpower. Their realm of Ultramar, standing as the last functioning example of what Guilliman's vision could have produced if the heresy had never happened. The Iron Hands still reject the weakness of flesh, still augment their bodies with cold metal, still punish themselves for the grief they cannot bring themselves to feel. As their council of iron fathers replacing the warmth of human leadership with the cold logic of machines that can never replicate what their father truly valued. The salamanders still protect the weak and fight for the common people, carrying Vulcan's compassion into a galaxy that has long since forgotten what compassion means. The white scars still ride fast and free, holding to the Khan's belief that a warrior's greatest weapon is not his blade, but his independence. And the Raven Guards still strike from the shadows, still wage their quiet wars of liberation, still honor the memory of a Primarch who believed that freedom was worth dying for. They are the absent fathers of an entire civilization, and their children, whether they know it or not, are still fighting the same wars, still carrying the same wounds, still searching for the same answers that their Primarchs never found. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, as the story of the Primarchs is both the origin and the essence of that endless conflict. It is a story about what happens when you create gods and then fail to love them. It is a story about the price of ambition and the consequences of abandonment. It is a story about 20 sons who were given everything except the one thing they needed most. And somewhere, in the cold spaces between the stars, in the howling corridors of the warp, was in the dreams of warriors who carry the blood of demigods in their veins, the echoes of that story are still reverberating, still shaping events, still waiting for the ending that has not yet been written. The Primarchs were created to unite humanity. They ended up nearly destroying it. And in that paradox, in the distance between what they were meant to be and what they became, lies the beating heart of the entire Warhammer 40,000 setting. A universe where the greatest threats to humanity come not from the aliens and demons that besiege it from without, but from the flaws and failures and unhealed wounds of the extraordinary beings who were supposed to be its saviors. It is a story about fathers and sons, about love and its absence, about the price of ambition and the weight of expectation, about what happens when you create gods and then refuse to treat them as people. Whereas it is a story that speaks to something deep and primal in the human experience, the universal knowledge that even the most powerful beings in existence are, in the end, just children looking for a parent who understands them. And it is a story that, for all its science fiction grandeur and cosmic scope, asks a question as old as language itself. Can the wounds we carry from childhood ever truly be healed? Or do they simply grow larger as we grow stronger, as until they consume us and everything we have built? The Primarchs never found the answer. Perhaps we never will either. But in the asking, in the searching, in the stubborn refusal to stop trying, even when the darkness closes in on every side, there is something that transcends the tragedy. There is the spark that keeps humanity alive, even in the grimmest darkness of the far future. There is the ember that no amount of war, or corruption, or cosmic horror can quite extinguish. There is hope. And maybe that is the real lesson of the Primarchs, the one that survives beneath all the grief and glory and wasted potential. They were created to be perfect, and their imperfections tore the galaxy apart. They were designed to be weapons, and their humanity made them something more dangerous and more valuable than any weapon could ever be. They were meant to unite a species, and their divisions showed that species what it really meant to be broken. But in the cracks, yes, in the places where the light gets in, despite every effort to seal it out, there is something worth holding on to. There is the memory of Sanguinius choosing to face a death he could have avoided because it was the right thing to do. There is Vulcan turning from the hunt to save strangers because their lives mattered more than any trophy. There is Korax liberating slaves because no being should have to live in chains. There is Gilliman waking up in a nightmare and choosing, despite everything, to keep building. There is Dawn standing on walls that everyone told him would fall and refusing, with every atom of his being, to let them. Even in the darkest places, even in the cruelest times, even among beings engineered to be instruments of destruction, the choice to be something more than what you were made to be remains. It always remains. That is the stubborn, inconvenient truth that neither the machine nor the darkness can quite stamp out. there is hope. Thank you for listening. And if this journey through the origins of the Primarchs has moved you, if it has deepened your understanding of the galaxy's greatest saga, then do consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a like. Every subscription helps bring more stories like this to life, and there are so many more to tell. Until next time, stay safe out there among the stars. The Emperor protects.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.